Welcome back, everybody, to the Marketing Rules podcast. And it is my absolute pleasure today to be joined by Martin Lindstrom. Martin, it's a pleasure to have you on today. I've been trying to get you on the podcast for nearly a year, and it's brilliant to have you join me today.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, for anyone who doesn't know Martin is an author on branding and marketing, and I first got introduced to you and first was made aware of you because of your brand sense book, released almost 20 years ago, kind of in a few years' time. And as I was just saying to you before we got started, it was one of the reasons that I actually got into marketing myself. The book was, I'm not a massive reader of business books. Okay. So
neither am I, to say
no. So for me to work it all the way through your book is quite a thing, but it was one of the things that really kind of got me going. It kind of opened my eyes to the way that branding and marketeers are able to sell to us and able to kind of make these brands aware to us. And what I thought we could do today was do a little bit of a kind of a critique of do some of the kind of the topics and discussion points you talk about in the book. Do they still stand today? And what can we learn from that? What's changed? What hasn't changed? But before we get onto that, maybe you could give us a little background on how you came to write the book and how you came to decide to write the book in the first place. And it is based on some kind of some surveys that was as well. So maybe kind of a little bit of explanation of that before we get going.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure if you tried this, James. I certainly have. That you sit in a car and suddenly there's a piece of music coming on the radio, and it's a song from when you were 15 years of age. It's almost like it takes you into an express elevator straight back in time, and you can feel where you were. You had the same emotions. It's almost like you could smell what was going on here. And it's really vivid. Mm-hmm. If you tried that, or if you tried that suddenly you smell a certain smell and it makes you change your mind, then really what you realized is that we as human beings are more than just the two senses, which is activated right now, mm-hmm. the sense of sight and sound. And back in 2003, when I wrote the book and originally coined two terms, one is sensory branding, another one is sensory marketing, I thought it was kind of crazy that marketing, branding, communication was only appealing to two senses. Why not all five senses? I mean, you go into a sound studio today and you can sort of dial up the different variations of bass and whatever it is in the sound. But why don't we have 5 of these panels and each of them are different senses? Because my hypothesis back then was the more we are impacted by a sense, the more we'll recall it. And that was really the base philosophy of this. Now, one thing is to have a hypothesis. Another thing is actually to prove it's right. So I teamed up with Milber Brown, which is a larger research company. And we were attempting to understand the impact of this. And what we learned was really fascinating. We did learn that the hypothesis of the more senses I expose you for, the more you recall it, the more it basically embed itself into the memory coding of your brain, and the more vivid it is. So basically the synergies are that if I expose you for one sense, let's say that gives you 20 points. If I expose you for 2 senses, it will increase to around 30 points. But if I expose you for 3 senses at the same time, I'm actually nearly doubling your ability to remember it, recall it, and be emotionally engaged with it. And no one had really proven this before. So out of that, I developed a range of different theories, basically saying, if you want to get value for money, don't just brand what you see on a piece of paper or listen to on the radio, online or whatever it is. Brand the space, brand the air, brand the feelings, brand everything, rituals, movements, all that stuff. And that became the birth of Brand Sense back in 2003.
I mean, that's the quintessential kind of explanation. If everybody's not read it, I do suggest go back and read it because it still holds up today. That said, though, we're going to have a kind of a chat around this. And in the book, one of the kind of the smell plays a huge part about that. Not enough, businesses use this. But But the thing is with something like a sense like smell is it's got to be local. You've got to be in that place. You've got to be in the Starbucks. You've got to be, you know, in the McDonald's. You've got to be wherever it is where you can kind of get that set the kind of that
Says
center.
who?
Yeah. How does that work though in a world which is now pretty much online, right? How do we kind of go about this, right? So, you know, in the Amazons and the Apples of the world, maybe not the Apples, but you know, these kind of online businesses, you know, where does brand sense sit in their kind of branding landscape?
Well, listen, you're coming with a really interesting assumption, which probably is incorrect. But let me just get back to that in a second.
Sure.
And first, take you back to what has happened during COVID-19. During COVID-19, what we discovered is something unusual. If you go back to the history of Procter & Gamble, P&G, and their philosophies, back in the 50s and 60s, they talked about entry points. We have throughout life 7 entry points. An entry point is something so profound that it changes the way you buy stuff, the way you interact with people, the way you live. Think about it. You expect a newborn baby. Suddenly there's baby strollers everywhere, and suddenly you have to move, you get new friends, you buy new toys, everything is changing. So we have 7 of those. But what I would claim happened during COVID-19 was that we, for the first time in living memory, were experiencing what I call the 8th entry point, a global synchronized behavioral change happening because of this pandemic. So why is that? Well, what happens is, and this is one of the theories I'm writing a lot about in a book published later on called Small Data, which is all about seemingly insignificant observations you make in your lives. And what I realized through that process of writing the book was that we all are out of balance. It may be I feel I'm overweight, so there's a weight loss product for that. It may be I feel alone, so you have Tinder. It may be I feel insecure, so I buy a Rolex watch to show that I'm secure. So these out of balances typically correlates with a need for a new brand or a new service. It is a gap between being in balance and out of balance, which really shows the potential for a brand. And what's really fascinating during COVID-19 was that out of balance were even kicked more into motions. We're even more out of balance. Out of balance means suddenly I think a lot of people, sadly, on planet Earth felt a loss of purpose in their lives. We can see that really sadly due to the suicide rates, due to the number of people trying to get hold of a psychologist. So that's some really disturbing numbers coming out of that. I would also claim that among others happened because of another trigger. And the other trigger was that we are not in contact with people. You know, when you and I talk about getting in touch, it actually also means in touch, physically in touch. And we do know from all sorts of studies, one of them which I wrote about back in the days in Brand Sense, was that an experiment was done with rats, where one set of rats were touched very frequently, another set of rats, the control group, was not touched at all. And guess what? The second group of control rats died much quicker. We know today that the biggest and most important organ we have on our body is the skin, and touch is fundamental for our life expectancy and lifespan. And due to that, what has happened is that as we've isolated ourselves with touch, we actually have suppressed an extraordinary important part of the neurochemicals which we're releasing in our brain. That has, among others, caused depression. So what has happened is that the sensory aspect has become out of balance. We actually crave for getting in touch with people. We crave for having smells around us. We crave for the senses which we can no longer get. It's almost like when you and I are on Zoom or Teams, that we watch the world and we kind of scratch on it like a glass window, but we cannot reach out to it and get in touch with it. And that creates an uneven, out of balance in our brain. So all this to say that the 8th entry point has actually pushed this even more towards the relevance of brand sense. And I think, let me give you 2 examples of that. One example is a wonderful restaurant in Australia, in Sydney, an upmarket restaurant near the harbour called Catalina. Just before COVID-19 hit Australia, they were a very popular restaurant, and they had at times candlelights on the tables across the restaurant with a very distinct, very unique smell. As the restaurant closed down and converted into takeaway food, the owner did a very smart move. She actually decided to use those candle lights with that frequency and pack them into the takeaway food. And what was really interesting was when people received this package with a candlelight in it, with a handwritten letter as well from the family, people felt they were activating those memories they had once they were sitting back in the good old days in the restaurant. Now, that was so popular on the takeaway food that they literally could not follow the demand. And as they went back after the crisis, the restaurant was completely fully booked and is that to this very day. And I spoke to the owner about why, and she said because people literally were celebrating the emotions they had once they were in the restaurant through the sense of smell. And that's a very good example about how you actually can utilize the senses in unusual ways, connecting different experiences on touch points. And that I think is important to have in mind, that as we increasingly in our world turn digital, I think we also rationally come to convince ourselves that that is the one and only path to communicate. It's easy, it's cheap, and it's the format we communicate with. But I don't know if you notice it, that point one, you receive so many emails today that is not even funny, and you actually don't have time to answer people anymore. You actually rudely are not answering certain people now, where you would have done that 5 years ago. And second, funny enough, if I look in your letterbox, how many Christmas cards did you receive last year?
Yeah, not many. Not many.
5?
Maybe something like that. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. So here's my question to you. If you have one communication channel which is completely exhausted, where you most likely will not even notice when you get a digital stupid email which says Merry Christmas and you click on it and Santa Claus jumps up and down, versus you get a Christmas card, which one do you think have the most impact? And by the way, which one would you then use? And that comes back to the conversation about the more people go in one direction, the more you should go into the other direction, further amplified because of the entry point. So the answer is it's never been more relevant than now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it makes complete sense. And, I love the aspect that it's called brand sense, but it's the senses activating emotions. And that's the thing that really kind of is the main point. It's those emotions that you're activating. You're just using different senses to do it, because as you've picked up on and said numerous times, there's usually just two senses that we're using, sight and audio, basically. But there's everything else kind of going on there as well. It's still interesting to me that the businesses that so if we took someone like Amazon, a huge kind of online retailer, how that taps into something like kind of brand sense and taps into those emotions, apart from disappointment when you get the wrong thing delivered, or there must be a way that they can tap into this, right?
Absolutely.
But how do they? I'm just saying. I bring this from a book because bring it back to the businesses that we deal with. Most of them are online, and it's very rare that. So it'd be interesting to kind of see how that kind of how you make the most of brand sense when you're simply just online.
I think what's important, first of all, to ask yourself is how good are you at what you're doing already? How strong are you at appealing to the senses? Now, for those of you listening here, it will be a bit confusing what I'm saying right now. But for those of you watching, let me just do a little illustration on the screen right now. So if you can see my screen right now, you will notice that there is a model coming up here. I call that a sensogram. And the sensogram really have 5 different dimensions, of course, representing our 5 different senses. So I'm just going to write them up here and say we have smell here, we have sound, touch, we have taste, and then what's the last one, just to check you here for a second?
So we've got touch, we've got sight, we've got sound, we've got smell.
We have smell, yes.
So we got. Hang on, what are we missing? This is a trick question. We got taste.
So we have smell, we have sound, we have touch, we have taste, and
what else are we missing? What are we missing?
And
Mark?
this is so interesting. You see, we are no longer in touch with our senses. Of course, it's a sense of sight, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is we forget about our senses. So let's just try to go back to this model. The first thing I would like you to do now is to help me define how good is Amazon at creating a sensory experience which is distinctly Amazon, which is not just I open a box and it touch. No, I get that. Everyone can do that. It's generic, but which is distinctly Amazon. Let's just take smell. Does Amazon have a unique smell? I would say no. Do they have a unique sound? That's my question to you.
No.
Okay. Do they have a unique look, so sight?
Well, it depends on possibly. I mean, but possibly, but only comes through because you're familiar with the Amazon brand. But I wouldn't say it has a particularly unique way of doing what it does when it comes to its visual representation.
Okay, so I'll take it 2 out of 3.
Yeah.
Taste, I would probably say no. Is that right? Touch?
Now, this is an interesting one because I guess there is something around receiving the packages from Amazon that might kind of activate something.
But if I gave you another package from whatever competitor Alibaba in a cardboard box, would you be able to feel the difference?
I don't think there's anything unique about the way they,
Okay. So really, in reality, their current sensogram looks like that, right? Now, if I should try to brainstorm and say, how far could they go? Is it fair to say that whenever you open a box, a cardboard box, actually could have a signature smell? I'm not saying it's like you're going down to the perfume department of Harrods, but I'm saying it could have, just like a new car have a new car smell, that Amazon actually have a smell. I would say that actually would be pretty distinct. And in fact, it could be so distinct that because they have such a big volume, they'll be very well known for it, as long as it doesn't conflict with what's inside, of course. I don't need to tell you. Okay, so what about sound? Well, actually, I don't think you're right about that low. I think they're slightly high because they have Alexa, and Alexa has a very unique voice and an ability to talk. But I would also claim that, in fact, they could have a unique sound when you buy stuff online. What is the click activation sound confirming that you now have purchased it? What's the sound which is telling you that now an Amazon package has arrived, and your phone is telling you that on the app? Is there sound for that?
Yeah.
Okay. What is the sound when I go into Amazon Prime and I'm going to watch a movie there? And by the way, what's the sound when I talk to my Alexa and it has confirming voices? In fact, I think, Anthony, you could go very, very far on that one. And then, of course, you have sight. So sight comes back to a theory of mine, which I launched originally in brand sense and later on explored in biology, biology. It comes back to the Coca-Cola bottle and how it was invented in 1915. The briefing was to develop a bottle so smart that if you drop it on the floor and it smashes into thousands of pieces, you can still pick up a piece of glass and recognize the brand. I call that a smashable. Now, in terms of sight, can you remove the logo and recognize Amazon today? Well, it's not that straightforward, okay, but I would claim you actually can do that if you really want to do that. You can have a certain pattern on the boxes. You can certainly have a certain look and feel on the site or anywhere else, which is so distinct that I know and recognize the navigation system, for example, on the website, on Prime, on the app, and whatever. All this stuff could be coming together. So I would say it could be pretty high. Taste, I wouldn't say is relevant. And I'll say touch actually could be very interesting, just like when you open a Tupperware container and it has a sealed sound and feel, which is a trademark of Tupperware, or just like you had with Marlboro cigarette packs in the old days, this ripple effect on the foil you're taking off. You actually could do the same with the tape. So when you're unfolding, unpacking things, it will be very distinct. So I think it would be pretty high. So when we talk about that, and I'm just showing you now what the potential of Amazon is, there's a pretty dramatic difference between what they're doing and what they could do. Yep. And what we know today, if I was to add up these numbers, in reality, I probably double the brand, not purchase, but brand emotional impact. Yeah. Meaning that I will memorize it more, I'll be more aware of who I'm dealing with, and I'll probably over time create a stronger relationship with the brand, right?
I mean, yeah, if anyone from Amazon is watching, then you just kind of planned out the next 10 years for them. But yeah, I mean that was a great kind of illustration of how, online businesses can make much more of these kind of brand senses. The other thing that I found really interesting in the book that you touch on is the relationship between kind of religion and ritual, and how that kind of plays into kind of brand sense, and that it's more, I mean, not necessarily, but more the kind of ritualistic piece on, and I suppose that's something that can be related back to the way you use an online portal of some kind. There's a ritual in the way that that all works. Um, and maybe you can kind of talk a little bit more around that, because I found that kind of really interesting, that kind of relationship between kind of ritualistic and brand awareness.
I think the most important thing to say with religion is that religion is probably, if you look at things in a historic perspective, the closest emotional connection people have with a phenomenon which is not themselves or their family members. Religion is defining our sense of purpose, the reason why we're here. It gives us a framework to live by and believe in. As the world has undergone a situation where I think increasingly we become very rational thinking, I think a lot of people have discarded religion and come to the conclusion of, well, that's fine for others. I don't believe in whatever. And what's really interesting, though, is even I've been super critical of religion. All studies are proving that the more religious you are, the longer you live. So there's a direct correlation between belief systems and our sense of purpose and how long we live, which comes back to the conversation we had previously, that young people lack a belief system. The phone is simply not giving them that, because everything is flicking and is so disposable that there's nothing which is tangible. We don't believe in our politicians. We don't believe in celebrities. We kind of even don't believe in the royal family. Just ask about your royal family at the moment. No, we really don't believe in a lot of stuff, right? So the reality is we want something to believe in, and that thing could be brands. And that was really that hypothesis I had many years ago, where I said, well, what is the correlation between brands and religion? So what I did, I think I launched a theory in brand sense, and then I conducted the largest neuroscience study in the world using fMRI, where we, among others, did a study out of Oxford, but also 6 other countries, with 2,000 respondents, where we wanted to find out the impact, not just of our senses, by the way, but also, among others, about our relationship with religion. And one of the things we learned by recruiting 1,000 highly religious Christians, we took Christianity because it's the largest religion on planet Earth, was that there was indeed a direct correlation between religion and branding, meaning that the more religious you are, the same spot is activated in your brain as if you are a very strong believer of, without comparison, I want to stress, but with Hello Kitty or with Apple or with Harley Davidson or some of those cult-like brands. And that really helped me to spark a theory about what are the ingredients is creating such powerful religion. So I traveled around the world for 2 years interviewing religious leaders and came up with a list of 10 ingredients which are defining the religions. And what was really striking in this whole research was that, with only one exception, basically every religion were based on the same construct. They had a clear enemy, they had storytelling, they had the sensory appeal, sense of belonging, all those different things. So what I did then was to further investigate these ingredients to understand how strong impact they have on our brain. And out of that, we created what I call the HSP theory, holistic selling proposition. So in the good old days, you would have USP, unique selling proposition, or ESP, emotional selling proposition. Well, what I realized was the next generation of ESPs probably would be either a HSP, holistic, where you look at things from a religious point of view to give people a stronger sense of purpose in life, or it would be what I call the MSP, standing for me selling proposition. That is, I become the brand. Now, this is a theory I developed 22 years ago. So that was before we had Facebook and all the likes. But it's just to tell you that the construct is still extraordinarily relevant. It does not mean that it's used a lot. I think actually almost the opposite has happened, at least with HSP. MSP has taken off a lot. But the reason why is because people, marketeers in particular right now, are so rational focused and so number driven in the way they do promotions and marketing that it has to be immediately measurable. And a religion cannot be immediately measurable. It's a long-term investment, which is almost a rarity in companies today. So for those few companies which believe in a long-term perspective, like Lego, like Apple, like Nike, well, they actually use these methodologies a lot. But for those companies which want to do a quick and dirty revenue thing, well, it's just not that relevant for them because they can't measure it on the short term. And therefore, why would I bother? Because I'm out of this game anyway in 2 years from now on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. So a lot of the people that will be listening to this will be kind of from the smaller side of businesses. There'll be SME sides kind of businesses. And as the marketeer to those businesses, we come across this, the ROI, what is going to be the ROI, this return on investment. This is something we kind of get, always have to kind of deal with. And as marketeers, we have this kind of constant battle to say, well, what are the long-term kind of, what's the long-term game here? And really what we're talking about is the holistic selling proposition. Basically, we're talking about HSP. We're talking about building out a much more kind of valid brand as opposed to these quick and dirty wins. Now, as I mentioned before we started, a lot of people possibly listening to this will be in the recruitment space, where that's a very, that's basically a very fast moving kind of industry. And it wouldn't come as a shock to anyone, but sometimes it can be quick and dirty. You've got to kind of turn things around very, very quickly. But I've always bought into this kind of holistic selling proposition, and I always try to kind of push this longer term brand, which comes on to my kind of next question. We've talked a lot about kind of bigger brands, but how do smaller brands, how do these kind of SME size businesses kind of tap into brand sense, this emotional kind of connection, these rituals that we've kind of talked about, and kind of this holistic selling proposition?
I think that smaller brands actually would find it even easier to tap into it than bigger brands. At least that's what I've learned over the years. As you know, we work with probably some of the largest companies in the world. And what's very clear for me is if you are a large organization and you want to adopt the sensory dimension, let's say, then you actually need to do this holistically. You need to do it across so many divisions and functions in your company that it requires the silos to work together. And that certainly some years ago was the biggest challenge we had. That was, if I want to have a signature sound on McDonald's or a signature taste for McDonald's, which is what we call a taste bullet, that it's consistent, not just across a restaurant environment, but that the dressing you use in your Big Mac is the same tasting dressing and the burger tastes the same way if I'm in India, in Mumbai, where cows are not allowed to be turned into meat, versus another place where pigs are not allowed to be. And what's really interesting is that that's possible, but it requires so much effort to make so many divisions and functions and cultures and markets work together. If you are a smaller business, it's super easy for you. And the first step you need to ask yourself is, what is the best low-hanging fruit opportunity you have to stand out in an environment where you today are not utilizing the senses? So if you, for example, are doing delivery service, let's say that's online e-commerce delivery service, I can't count the number of times I've had a DSL person coming by and he was smelling like he has been on the road for the last 2 weeks without having a shower. What's wonderful for him because he can't smell it himself. But if you now are buying your latest perfumes from Chanel and he's the one delivering it, it kind of gives a bit of a conflict in your brain, right? All this to say is that touch points quite often can have an impact. And it's up to the company to understand where can we have the biggest impact. In this case, why don't you have a signature fragrance every driver delivers with? Not only will it give you a sense of cleanness, it would also most likely give you a sense of joy, because whenever I get this package, I smell that smell. That means suddenly DSL actually have a point of differentiation beside their red and the yellow colors. So what I'm saying is, find what that touch point is. And just as we talk about this, the restaurant with Catalina, you can basically do it with any industry, I would claim. You just need to figure out what is the low-hanging fruit and what is the 1 cent when no one else is using it. But do me a favor, don't go too far. I mean, don't give people candy of a certain taste for the sake of doing it. First of all, it would be very expensive for you. And second, it is not creating a point of differentiation. What's really important is that what you do is smashable. And remember, smashable is it's so distinct, I can remove the logo and still recognize the brand from whatever sense it's appealing to. So I would claim every business can do it. And in fact, it's much easier for SME to do it than a larger corporation.
Yeah. I think with the SME size businesses, they're a bit more agile and they don't have that kind of scale, that they don't have to try and kind of replicate that on scale, which makes complete sense. So my last question to you, Martin, before I let you go is, when you take kind of HSP and it is everything that we've kind of discussed, it's the brand sense, it's the senses, it's the emotion. Can you skip the senses and go straight for emotions? Is that, or are they so tied together now? Could you kind of create, a brand where you just, it is much more about, the feeling you get as opposed to the kind of triggering the senses and then triggering the feeling? Is it going to be the other way around?
You absolutely can. I mean, I'll go back to the theory I've done of craving. It's a longer story, but in biology, in the book Biology, one of the things I proved through our neuroscience work was that the health warnings on cigarette packs are having the opposite effect. That means that when it back in the days was saying smoking kills, it actually encouraged you to smoke even more. It was a very, very controversial study, which later on was published and is one of the key reasons why health warnings on cigarette packs has changed since. But one of the things I looked into was an area in the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which also is called the craving spot. And again, there's multiple papers published around the assumptions I'm coming with right now. And what we learned from the nucleus accumbens was that craving is really activated through different types of signals. So it can be in the sense of sound. If I, for example, right now, and maybe you can add this sound on the interview, but let's say I was to listen to a grill with a steak on it, a barbecue grill, and just have that crackling sound. Imagine I was playing that sound now. And by the way, I would then add another sound bite, which will be you pouring a Coca-Cola into a glass with ice in the glass, right? I'm pretty sure with almost 50% guarantee, if not 75% guarantee, that the audience would feel more hungry. They will have a stronger sense of craving. Well, that's an emotional engagement, right? It's not a branded emotional engagement. It actually can be. If I'm playing the I'm Loving It tune, it actually generates a sense of craving, which is a branded craving, right? There's difference between branded and unbranded. So you definitely can do that. But I also have to tell you, and I'm going to come with a comparison here, which certainly is not allowed in the US, but I know you're from UK, so you can handle it. But if you take pornography, for example, pornography is only appealing to two senses. It creates a sense of activation. But if you are together with a person where the tactile is and where the smell is and whatever it is, then you are much more engaged. So I don't need to tell you, the more you are using the senses, the more emotionally engaged you are. So what I'm saying here is the fact that you are not using all the senses does not mean that you shouldn't try to use as many senses as you can within the restrictions you have. Go as far as you can. And once you have the opportunity to jump the fence and go the full Monty, well, then do that. But be aware of that most likely your competitors are lazy. And the competitors are lazy, so when they send that Christmas card, they send it as a PDF. And by the way, it's the same generic sounds coming up on the website, and everything is like everything else because everything is built using the same tools. It's easy, it's cheap, it's fast, and let me get out of here very quickly to another job type of feeling. What you have to say to yourself is, how do I make every touch point and every interaction truly branded and unique? And if you do that, again, on the short run, you may not feel a big difference. But I'll give you a very good example. I'm sending out every year 800 handwritten Christmas cards. And I'm not kidding. I'm starting writing them in May. I write 10 cards every day, and they typically have a very fun theme around them, and people love them. They love them so much that out of the 800, I typically get 700 emails in reply. And the first thing they're saying is, please don't put me off or take me off your mailing list. And now, I don't know how often you get emails from people you just send a Christmas card to, because you probably don't send a Christmas card, right? And so the issue I'm saying here is I use a certain effort to activate certain senses, and it has an impact. It has an impact because I go the extra mile. And I think in our society today, we're just not prepared to do it. We want to have the quick win. And guess what? Then it becomes very temporary, everything, right?
I think those are great words for anyone listening, whether they're business owners or other marketeers, is to keep kind of pushing the envelope, go the extra mile, and a few other metaphors about thinking outside the box. Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. We've gone from Amazon to pornography in about half an hour, which was. We will include all of your details in the show notes, and people can kind of can reach out, get in touch, and I suggest also kind of order some of your. Order Brand Sense or one of your other books, because they're all definitely worth a read. But for now, Martin Lindstrom, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. A pleasure.